Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 23. Today we're going to talk about desistance from crime. So for most of this class, especially when we've been talking about theories of crime, everything that we've been talking about has to do with why people start committing crime. What the process is to cause people to develop into, people who are committing crime. And the key issue today, the way that this lecture is going to be a little bit different, is we're starting kind of at the end of that cycle and addressing a question that a lot of criminologists for, the better part of the 20th century didn't really address, which is why do people stop committing crime? Are the processes the same? Do different kinds of people tend to desist more than others? All of these kinds of questions, really, if you're a criminologist and you want to understand the process of criminality, is a very important issue to address. So if you think back to the age crime curve, again, for most of this class, what we've been interested in is that initial spike, that initial rise in adolescence, leading to a lot of offending in early adulthood, 18 to 20 years old. But today, what we're going to talk about is this remarkably consistent finding in criminology, which is the fact that almost everybody, large numbers of people who commit a lot of crime in young adulthood and adolescence, really stop committing crime once they enter middle and later adulthood. So when we talk about desistance, many people define the desistance process in many different ways. Think about how you would define what it means for somebody to be desisting from crime. Do you define it as someone can be called a desister after their last known crime, so you can only be called a desister if you've completely stopped? Or is it more of a general declining process? Can you say that somebody is desisting if the frequency and the amount of crime that they're committing over crime experience is kind of a slow decline? It's not really a lot of agreement in the field over where exactly we put this point, we put this measuring rod. Some people like to think of it as cold turkey, that if you have experienced, several years of committing crime and then all of a sudden you stop, you can kind of mark the desistance process there. Whereas other people are more inclined to think of it as a process that takes a lot of time, that even though you might still be offending a little bit, as long as you are declining and showing change, that's when we could define it as being desistance. So there's a lot of disagreement on what, how this process actually works, how it develops. And another way to think about this when you're talking about desistance is what kind of things have to change in a person for you to say that they are desisting from crime. In other words, does it require persons changing their behavior? If they stop committing crime, if they actually stop engaging in the crime, is that enough to call them a desister? Or do you have to also see a change in the person's beliefs and attitudes? In other words, can you call someone a desister if they still really want to commit crime and for whatever reason they're not? Is that the same kind of person as somebody who has an actual attitude, belief adjustment, and change? And there are some people who think that if you're going to actually call someone a desister, somebody who is desisting from crime, that they have to show elements of both. That not only do their behaviors have to change, but they have to demonstrate a change in their beliefs about what's okay to do, beliefs about committing crime, and their attitudes about whether or not criminal behavior is okay, is acceptable, is justified in their circumstance. So in crim theory, there have been a couple different attempts at trying to define this desistance process. A fairly recent book written by a criminologist named Shad Maruna described in depth the desistance process that he observed in case studies of several individuals. And Shad Maruna's book, which the title begins with Making Good, and essentially what he talks about in this book is that desistance, he has a very specific definition of what desistance means for crime. And he defines desistance as the long-term abstinence from crime among individuals who had previously engaged in, long-term persistent patterns of offending. So there's a couple things to think about with that definition. First of all, he's talking about abstinence here. So for Maruna, when you call someone a desister, the expectation is they're not committing any additional crimes. He doesn't really essentially agree with the fact that somebody who's just committing less crimes is someone you could call somebody who's desisting. So for him, this abstinence part of it is a critical element. Another critical element of his definition is the idea that you can only call someone a desister, you can only call something a desistance process if it's a long-term process. If this person has experienced an abstinence from crime for a long time. So, in other words, if you're somebody who committed crime for the better part of your adolescence and young adulthood and then went through a few months where you weren't, he doesn't think that's an appropriate amount of time yet to call someone a desister. So you should remember the criminologists Robert Sampson and John Lobb from their age-graded theory of informal social control. Now, that theory was a life course theory, trying to explain criminal behavior throughout the life course. And a really important part of their theory was attempting to explain the entire process that one goes through in terms of criminal behavior. So that included, in their theory, the desistance process. And after their initial book, in 1993, they continued to talk about this and write about this, like what this desistance process means to them. So, in their theory, they had a couple different pieces of terminology that they wanted to make distinctions between. First of all, they talked about termination, meaning that at some point in a person's life, there's a point where criminal activity stops. For someone who's a desister, there is a point where you are no longer committing crime. But for them, that's not what desistance means. It doesn't. You can't just define it as you're no longer committing crime, because for them, desistance is this underlying process by which termination occurs. So for Sampson and Lobb, they think of desistance as much more of a gradual process that eventually over time is going to result in termination. But for them, they really didn't see it as being something that is a all or nothing kind of situation. In other words, somebody who is slowly declining and experiencing a gradual change where eventually they don't commit crime anymore, that's someone that for them you could call a desister. So there have been some important research findings in criminology literature talking about the desistance process. And one of the most consistent things that we know about the relationship between age and crime, the relationship between getting older and stopping, is the prevalence of criminal behavior does decline with age. Overall, if you're looking at the aggregate numbers of everybody in the population, people who commit crime in general do commit less crime as they get older. But another really important part of that finding is not everyone does this the same way. There's a lot of variability in people's desistance process. And while the incidence of crime doesn't necessarily decline with age, it may actually increase for some subgroups. So in other words, just because the majority of people are declining in how much crime they're doing, for individual people, they might still commit crime at the same amounts. For some subgroups of individuals within our population, there might be no difference with age. And it's a really important part of people who wanted to study desistance in criminologies, understanding this variability. So again, and for a lot of this class, we'll be talking about people that are very prominent in the life course, the developmental side of criminology, because for the most part, these are theorists who are interested in a person's development in and out of criminal behavior. And one thing that they talk about and that they really stress in the research about desistance is no one's arguing that there is not continuity in offending. One of the most stable facts about criminal behavior is there are a lot of people who are criminal adults who had a very delinquent, deviant childhood, adolescence leading up to their adult criminal behavior. But what they argue and what makes this research kind of unique in the past couple decades is not everybody exits out of this process in the same way. There are a lot of different pathways that people can take to stopping from committing crime. In other words, yes, almost everybody declines, but not everyone declines in the same ways. And depending on what kind of a development you've had, that's going to say a lot about what ways are going to be best for you in terms of getting out of criminal activity.